Welcome, everybody, to Broadcast Team Alpha, where we bring you cutting edge conversations while exploring the quantum possibilities. It's Wednesday night. It's the Wednesday night show. I'm Nori Love. I am graced by my co host, Aage Nost, and we have an amazing guest that Augie's going to tell you about. But first, I'd like to invite you to connect with us. You can connect with us on broadcastteamalpha.com. You can subscribe to our YouTube channel. And be sure that when you subscribe, if you would like notifications, just click the little bell and then you'll get notifications every time that we're live. And we just want to thank you for being here and thank you for supporting us. And a big thank you to the moderators and to everybody in the chat room. And you may notice that there's a new function. I guess it's not that new now, but it was new to us a couple of weeks ago. And it's the super chat function. And if you would like to support us that way with a donation, we're very grateful. And whatever way you support us, we are so grateful. Just want to say the content and the views of our guests are not necessarily those of Broadcast Team Alpha, but we do invite you on this journey tonight into cutting edge conversation, and we invite you to suspend your disbelief and to come with a blank canvas to paint on tonight. So without any further ado, Aage, hi.
Hi.
Will you tell us about David?
Yes, that would be a delight to do. David Collis, he's living right here in Tucson, just on the other side of town from where I'm at. He's a native of Southern California, of course, now living in Tucson. He's done a lot, and I want him to explain a lot more about that when I get done with him here in about a minute and a half. He said he characterizes his life as a quest driven by romance of exploration and innovation, and boy, does he do that. Mm-hmm. And he also follows his dream and has become a world traveler and explorer. He's also a student of old world history and religious history. And then he has some incredible experience where he made contact with an entity, the consciousness that most of us knows as Jesus. Mm. And this Jesus, he is known to the Romans in the surviving records as Joshua Bet Halachman. That was his Hebrew name. And then he also wrote a book interviewing Jesus, the man, after he got the connection to the consciousness. And I am sitting here looking at the book, and I'll tell you, I've been reading it, and it gets interesting because much of it does not coincide with what it says in the Bible. There is a split of doctrine here, and this could be really good. So I want to, without any more ado, I want him to come on and talk about this cool dude we call Jesus. Welcome to the show, David.
Welcome. Well, thank you for having me. It's wonderful.
Thank you for
we had a lunch here actually about 5 days ago now, and we had a 2-hour lunch, and the reason we weren't talking for 4 hours was because my parking meter was running out. This got interesting.
Little things.
Well, I'm just going to jump in really quick and say that I am reading the book and I am totally rapt. I mean, I love the way that you have dialogue between you and Jesus, and I mean, right off the bat, the book is new, so I'm not that far into it, but I totally love Jesus already. I mean, it's amazing, just amazing.
Well, it's funny because people will ask me, what do I do? And I'll tell them that I'm a writer. And then the immediate follow-up question is, well, what have you written? And I say I've written a biography about Jesus. And the conversation kind of comes to an end. And it's kind of funny on what the expression is, because everybody thinks they know something about Jesus. And what I can say is that our understanding of Jesus is primarily through a theological perspective. It is not from the human side of Jesus. It is not from the type of man he was. It doesn't talk about any of his character traits. The church seems to be very interested in keeping certain ideas about Jesus to a minimum. And what I started to explore is the facets of Jesus's personality, what he had to really say, and how those sayings are, in some regards, not theologically motivated by salvation theory. So I'm not one who disparages Christianity, but I'm also not one to really try to embrace it anymore. I was at one time, I would say, a born again Christian, but my concerns and my issues about Jesus in relationship to other people, historical people, was a little bit too great for me, and I ended up having to really try to understand Jesus in a new light.
Interesting.
I think he was totally misunderstood in many different ways too. There are people out there that say, there is no evidence that he even existed. Well, there is enough evidence I found that he did exist. There is this man that we call Jesus, but he's totally different from what I were led to believe, because he came back from his travels and he was teaching equality between men and women. And of course, that didn't go over too well with the Jews. And there's so many differences. And I don't have any idea. There's so much to talk about. You got the floor. What can you tell us?
Okay, so would you like me to talk about the book, or would you like me to talk a little bit about my process on how I got to the book?
Yes, let's do that.
Yes.
Okay. Yeah. So from my earliest experiences, I have always been a dreamer. So I've been able to remember my dreams even from the time I was like 4 years old. And spirituality and the ideas of advanced spiritualities have always kind of been with me. At an early age, I felt like I was involved with creative visualization. And so I can imagine myself doing things, and then I would be doing it. And then I was interested in like the chariots of the god and Bermuda Triangle. So these ideas that are kind of off the, kind of over there a little bit on the corner of our societies is something that I've always been interested in. And then I had an event that occurred to me when I was 19 years old. And that event catapulted me into the role of a seeker, and I became an apprentice to consciousness. And what happened is that I had an existential crisis. And this crisis kind of like blew me up. And I was very suicidal at the moment. So I ended up finding myself asking some very big questions. Who am I? Where am I going? What is life? Who is God? And that's put me on this this odyssey. And the odyssey lasted roughly 30 years. And it took me around the world. It took me into places of healing, very different types of healings that you would normally have. It took me into Jungian thought and Joseph Campbell. And I found myself extraordinarily curious and asked a lot of questions. I was interested in adventure. And at the same time, all of the kind of the mystical sides of who I am really started to open up. And I had to come to terms with, what I was seeing and what I was feeling and what I was, and all the intuitions that I was having. So, and then religion was part of this process, as was building and art. So my mother's an artist, my father is a builder, and my life is, got those two components in it, and plus I have the mystical side to me. And I've been trying to, integrate all three of those personality traits together. So when I was 21, I had 3 visions of Jesus. And so Jesus came to me, and at that moment, I ended up finding myself in the world of Christianity. And from there, I've kind of, I wouldn't say that I planted a flag, but I definitely went through different phases of the Christian experience. I went through a fairly devoted phase. I went through a church phase. I went through a trying to understand the historical development phase. I ended up in the Christian mist phase. In fact, my the epilogue in my book is dedicated to a quote by Thomas Merton. I ended up reading a lot of Thomas Merton's material, and then from there I got into St. Augustine and St. Teresa of Avila and Meister Eckhart and St. John of the Cross. And so these people were kind of like my friends, and I found myself like kind of feeling my way through all of this territory of spirituality, the depth of spirituality, the historical roots of spirituality. And it wasn't just Christian anymore. It was Christianity, and it was the Hindus and the Buddhists. So it encompassed quite a bit. And so at some point, I finally had another very powerful mystical experience. People would call it enlightenment. And then with that experience, I was able to, I happened to be reading the Gospel of Thomas at the time. And one moment I didn't understand much of what the sayings were. And the next moment I could understand almost all of them. So once that happened, I started to realize that Jesus had a very similar experience, and he was talking about those types of experiences. And I realized that there was a very strong disconnect between what the church was presenting and what Jesus actually knew. And from there, I ended up giving a 4-part lecture series on the Gospel of Thomas. And then not long after that, I decided that I needed to work on my book. And that's where the book ended up coming. So was out of that. And it's like, I see it as the confluence of all these different experiences and all these different threads that were occurring in my life, and kind of the motivation and the drive that I had to solve certain problems and to understand certain things and to travel the world and to build things. So this was kind of the culmination point of that journey. And so I wrote the book, and now I'm on a completely different path. So okay, I am not able to.
I was muted. I'm so sorry. So, I love how in the beginning you talked to Jesus about the way that the church portrayed him and the things that people expected of him, and he said something about theology. I can't quite remember exactly what it was, but I love that dialogue. And what kind of a man? Okay, so let me just go back. From what I understand from the introduction, you connected with the consciousness of Jesus.
What I ended up doing is I was reading the Gospel of Thomas, and I was reading the Sufi literature. And in January of 2012, I was sitting in a friend's house. It was right after Christmas and the New Year. And I had these books open, and all of a sudden it's just like the scales from my eyes just fell off. And the way I describe it is like as if there was a flower, a sunflower that just came from the back of my head and pointed to the sun. And then I had an immediate download of all this mystical knowledge.
Wow.
Of the world.
Wow.
And from that, I realized that the way that we understand Jesus is not accurate.
Yes.
And it's a very theological portrait. And so from there, I ended up having to go through a deconstruction phase. And one of the things that I ended up doing, aside from the lecture series, but the way in which the Gospel of Thomas is presented, it is just the sayings of Jesus. So there are 114 sayings of Jesus. Now, we know that Jesus didn't say all those things. But the thing is that there are 1/3 of those sayings are in the New Testament. The others are of the community of which Jesus is the inspiration for. Mm. And Jesus inspired this community into the wisdom that he had. So it's a very different understanding that Jesus was presenting to another group of people, which now it's almost as if there's a split. And you're going to see that there was what is referred to as the Gnostic Christians, but at the time, they weren't considered Gnostics. They just understood knowledge. And then there was kind of what you would call as the proto-Christian, which is more of the Paul side of things. And the two of them ended up not really liking each other. So there was already like an early fault line. And that fault line ended up, going through some earthquakes and fracturing and breaking apart. And then by the end of the first century, they were hurling insults at each other and attacking each other in a very kind of aggressive manner.
Yes. So what kind of a man was Jesus?
Okay,
what kind of a person was he?
This is where it gets really fascinating. So one of the techniques that I had to deal with, which was, who is this person? So there's this intellectual understanding that I had. I knew that there was something to his spiritual philosophy that wasn't necessarily the salvation theory and salvation theology that is presented in Christianity. But I really didn't fully appreciate the type of person that he was. And so what I ended up doing is I took all of Jesus's sayings based off of what the Jesus seminar, the scholars from the Jesus seminars believe Jesus said. And I compiled 25 pages of his sayings.
Wow.
Now, I spent time with a Jungian analyst, and so I know what it's like when somebody has something to say. So with those 25 pages of sayings, I was able to determine the type of personality Jesus had. And the FBI calls this forensic linguistics. And ultimately, what I ended up doing is determining the type of personality and the type of person Jesus was through his sayings.
Wow.
And from those sayings, I knew that there was like an end. He kind of reached a point in his life where he was doing something based off of all the information that he had gathered prior to his ministry. And so once I was able to put down all those 25 pages of sayings, I then started to catalog them into groups. So by subject. So there was the kingdom of heaven saying. So he had 22 sayings of the kingdom of heaven, and there were 9 subjects. He talked about money and treasure. Well, that's interesting because that was the number one thing he talked about. The second thing that he talked about the most was food. So there are these interesting ideas about Jesus that you don't necessarily get, but when you compile all of these sayings together, you're starting to see something that's going on. And from that, from those sayings, when I started to analyze the whole subject of money, I realized that I'm looking at 4 different lenses. And there is a lens that deals with, I would say, the cash crop, an agricultural society, an agricultural product, something that's going on in which you're growing food, like a farmer would grow food or a rancher is growing food. The second one is that there is the merchant mentality. It's the one who's looking for avenues to present or to sell a product. The other one is how you work with your hands to make money. And then the fourth one was the inheritance. So here are 4 components of money. And then within those components of money, there was taxes, debt, capital gains, good and bad managers, labor disputes. And I thought, for somebody who is supposed to be poor, this is very sophisticated information that revolves around capital and money and how money works. And it made no sense to me that this person who was supposed to be a carpenter could have all of this background knowledge on money. At the same time, have all this esoteric knowledge that I found consistent with Hinduism, Buddhism, Taoism, and Confucianism.
Wow.
So I at that point I had to, there was something going on here that made no sense to me. And that's when I realized I had a puzzle that I needed to solve. And I kind of dug my teeth into it. And I got a big whiteboard out and I did an Excel spreadsheet and I just started laying out concept by concept by concept. And the way that I kind of looked at it was, I'm looking at, in baseball terms, I'm looking at the MVP of the league. How did you get there?
Right.
What were the steps? The ministry is like playing the game, but there were all these other things that occurred to him prior to his ministry that had to have occurred for him to get to the place where he was.
Right.
And from there, I was able to go, okay, well, I know something about Joseph Campbell and the hero's journey. And I went, okay, there are a number of components here that are now going to help guide me to this conclusion here, because I know what the end is. I don't necessarily know what the beginning is. I know a little bit. I know a few things. His sayings say something about it, but I just really had to dig into what his backstory would have been for him to arrive at the conclusion, one, to do the ministry, and two, to fill it with all this content.
Right.
It became probably obvious that,
excuse me?
It probably became obvious that he was well educated.
Yes.
And back in those days, you couldn't get much of that education unless you traveled and visited other cultures.
That's right. So there are several components in Jesus's backstory, and this is what I was able to determine. So Jesus was born into a pious family that had a lot of connections. They were wealthy. Now, I mean, that's not like Rockefeller wealthy, but at that time, you know, they came from more than a middle-class family. Mm-hmm. So he had to have been involved with some type of estate. They were merchants, and it's possible that there was some type of building that was involved. So whether he was a direct carpenter or whether or not he was a builder, I mean, the terms that are used is more like he's a builder as opposed to a direct carpenter. Jesus and his family both had a strong sense that he was destined to do something important and great. Jesus left home. My guess is somewhere between the age of 14 and 17. Jesus, as Aage said, studied and learned, and he practiced a lot of spiritual knowledge. 6, Jesus had 4 profound experiences in his life that informed his life, and it also ended up informing his ministry. And he had at least one, if not more, profound, like, enlightenment experiences.
Really?
Jesus was robbed and he was beaten. Jesus had either one or more sexual experiences that he felt ashamed by. And Jesus ended up what you would refer to as sinking into the pit of humanity and seeing the depravity of mankind and understanding just how bad life could really get. And then he and how ugly that was. Mm-hmm. And then he ended up returning home. And when he returned home, having all these experiences, there were members in his families that didn't necessarily accept him back in the family at the beginning. So those are the 4 ideas that I know happened to him. So the question now becomes, where did he go? And what kind of things did he experience?
Right.
And when you look at the ministry is going to reflect something that's occurring now, but there's also something in his backstory that it's reflecting. So I kind of looked at this as if let's just imagine I had a sailboat and I was sailing out of one of the small harbors in Southern California, and I never knew that there was such a thing as a cargo container, or that there was San Pedro or Long Beach. And one day I was out on my little 25, 30 foot, sailboat, and I almost get run over by a cargo ship that's, 1,200 feet long. Now I know that cargo ship has to go to some type of a harbor. Right. And the only harbor that I know is for 25 and 30 foot boats. And yet I'm looking at this thing that's, 1,000 feet long, that's 10 stories high. So that there's a relationship between what that boat is and who built it and where it's going.
Right.
So when I started to realize that Jesus had all this knowledge, there had to have been all of these things that occurred to him prior. And so this is when I say that these are the types of experiences that he had, when I looked at all of his sayings, I started to see these patterns, and the patterns are telling me something about his psychology. And those are the things that I know that occurred to him based off of, my own experiences studying psychology and my own Jungian therapy.
So what was his what was he like? What was his person? So I love that you followed all of these trends to piece together that beautiful backstory, and I love the analogy of the cargo ship that helped put things into perspective.
That's what I've been able to do very easily now, is put things into kind of these little metaphors, visual metaphors, so you can kind of see them to understand where it is that I'm coming from.
That's so good.
Okay, so let's just go back and just look to see what kind of things that he did in his ministry. Okay, one, he had an open heart. That's, anybody knows how difficult it is to have an open heart. How do you have an open heart? Right?
That hurts.
The other one is, how do you have an open mind?
Yeah.
And the other thing is that he did these amazing things with his body. Like, he had to do all, think about it. Every single day he's walking like 20, 25, well, I don't know, most 20 miles a day. So anywhere between, 1 to 20 miles a day. You have to have a lot of physical endurance to be able to manage your body and dealing with these levels of stress.
Yes.
His 40 days in the desert tells me another thing about him. He went through a deprivation phase, and I've done that. I've gone on my own vision quest, and I know what it's like to kind of deprive yourself of all the luxuries that you need, being out in the middle of the desert in the summer at 118 degrees.
Yeah. Wow.
And so he did it for 40 days. So there's something about him and his body that was absolutely critical. And he was able to kind of quell the needs of the body to be able to conduct his ministry. Plus he had, he had all these mystical experiences. So we're seeing the mystical experiences that were occurring that are recorded in the New Testament Gospels. But I know he had to have had them before. You don't just show up and go, I'm having mystical experiences. No, he seemed to already be inclined to have those. And then when you start asking yourself, well, who's the Father and what's the Father? Well, guess what? That comes from Pythagoras. The Father is a concept that comes from Greek mystical religious philosophy.
Interesting.
And it means the one.
Right.
So he's using Greek rhetoric, and he's using, in a sense, Greek mystical philosophy to kind of help explain what it is that he knows.
Wow.
So where did that come from? And again, I already told you, that he has Buddhist ideas and Hindu ideas and Confucian ideas and Taoist ideas in his ministry. But then there's Egyptian ideas. There's Essene ideas. And there's also the history of Judaism and his Hebrew heritage that's informing you. So all of these things are now converging and becoming part of his ministry. So he had to overcome the one big thing that I'm kind of like struggling with now as well, and that is, what do you feel like you want to do when the world seems to be completely turned upside down?
Yeah.
And you find people just absolutely horrific. And Jesus had to experience kind of the depravity of man, and yet he was able to overcome that, and he saw the need for mankind to have somebody to guide them into some new territory. Well, that takes an enormous amount of insight and kind of chutzpah and desire. I don't know what the right word is, but he seems to overcome his own emotional issues that he once had and that he once experienced. For him to
I guess that's what we would call a life coach, isn't it?
he was a life coach. In spite of everything, he started realizing, you know what, I have all this knowledge and I need to apply it. And he ended up applying it in his ministry.
So, I gotta tell you guys, right now there is huge thunderstorms above here. So if I disappear, you guys continue. This is getting serious up there.
Okay. So Jesus, this is hysterical. Jesus was the first life coach.
Yeah. So so the other thing that Jesus was, And you'll see this in his ministry, is that he was brave, courageous, and fearless. So, I mean, how many people would say, oh yeah, you know what, I'm ready to go to the cross and, you know, just be beaten to a pulp? I mean, you don't say those kind of things. So it was having to overcome the needs of the body. And then he was able to perform miracles.
Yes.
So one of the things that I also realized, that when I was looking at his sayings, I noticed that there was an autobiographical content to him. So what Jesus was telling me was the metaphors are coming from his own experiences. So, you know, what I have been able to find in my own life and from reading a lot of material is that most people don't talk that are really smart. They'll talk abstractly, but sometimes the abstractions are based off of some of the experiences that they've had. Yeah. So they can kind of bring it down to everybody's level so that they can go ahead and explain it. I know that for me, I learned how to surf. I was out in the ocean at 6 years old, and I know what it's like to have to deal with surfing, and I use surfing and being in the ocean as part of my spiritual metaphors. So I know from what the experiences that I had, that Jesus was doing the same thing. He was using his own life experiences to fill his parables and to fill his aphorisms. Wow. So Jesus was also, not only that, Jesus is a genius. He was extraordinarily smart. And he was able to take very abstract ideas and present them in very palatable ways. And anybody who, for me, he's like a poet. So anybody who has the ability to be, one, very observant as what's going on in the world, and two, able to take this idea and that idea and put together and create parables or metaphors so that you can kind of see them, I think is very, very smart. And he did it in a very kind of a gracious way. He seems to do it in a very effortless way. And he seems to be able to manage very difficult situations with ease. I mean, he's like he would be like a master martial artist who knows how to deflect, you know, oncoming kicks and punches and move out of the way and redirect them. And he does that all the time. And that's not, you don't learn that just by swinging a hammer. And believe me, I've been out on the construction sites and I've been around a lot of carpenters, and this is not the mentality of a carpenter. I mean, this is the mentality of a master martial artist, you know, but he didn't seem to be doing any martial arts whatsoever, but it's the same mentality.
Interesting.
Well, there is records of him having been in India. Yes. And in fact, there's writings there stating that the Messiah was there. So, yes, you know,
in fact, there's even, I think there's even like his footprints and so, yeah, I know that those are the stories. So it makes perfect sense to me that he would go. In fact, I know what the route was. It was usually a sea route. So he would have had to have traveled south from the Galilee down to the Red Sea. He would catch a boat at the Red Sea. He would go into a port somewhere in what is present-day Yemen. And then from there, he would be able to catch the trade winds and take them east to India. And then from there, once he got there, it seems as though he ended up, you know, at the base of the Himalayas.
So what would the crucifixion be if that didn't really happen? Was that a metaphor for something?
No, I think that actually occurred. I think that was, okay. Yeah. In fact, in my book, I devote a whole chapter to his death and what that.
The last chapter. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So I don't want to spoil anybody's excitement about what it is that I believe, but I do believe that he went through that process. Now, Aage, you have a different perspective that he actually didn't die on the cross, that he ended up being taken down from the cross and then ended up somewhere else.
There is actually writings to that effect that he was hung on the cross about noon, and that was the day before Passover, and Roman law said that they could not let anybody hang on the cross after sundown before Passover. So he had 6 hours on the cross. And, cross, there may have been a T. instead of a cross. But after 6 hours, when they took him down, there is actually writing to this also, the saying that the sky got dark and there was howling rain. The Roman soldiers got scared and ran for cover. So his followers came and took him down and took him into the cave and tried to revive him. He probably was one hurting puppy, I suppose. But there is actually some records of him having been in southern France after that's supposed to have happened. And then again, there's another in the surviving Roman record saying that he bought land outside of Rome in the year 63. Now, we can all wonder about these things because it's so long ago. And the Roman records may have been also, well, there's some indication that they wrote them to their own advantage possibly, but we really don't know. But that's what some of the stuff that I dug up.
So you were mentioning before some of the disciplines from some of the areas that Jesus pulled from. Do you think Jesus had like ties to Atlantis, or?
I can't go that way.
You can't go that way?
No, all I tried to do was look at his sayings and try to understand the Gospels for what they are and try to see what would be likely to have happened just to him. Now, all the other things, I mean, I believe in reincarnation. I know that I've had past lives, and it makes no sense to me that Jesus didn't have them at all, or he didn't have them either. And so there's no way that this man could have done what he did without having all of this. I think even going back further and further and further. The idea that he was the Son of God, that opens up another can of worms, and that kind of goes into why it was important for him to become or associated with the Son of God. And that kind of opens up another kind of avenue to explore. And if you want to go down there, we can. But
I do.
We can kind of discuss a little bit more about just the type of personality Jesus had before we do that. Because
absolutely,
it's really, really important to understand the type of man that he was, and then put him back into context. Because when I started to realize it was to me, this was very, very important and very exciting. I felt like I was an archaeologist and I was uncovering something, right? So we all understand the picture of Jesus in from one perspective and from one portrait, and that's what the church tells us, and that's the theological perspective. And so these ideas that I've been telling you right now, I had no clue as to what these were. But as I was digging and trying to understand, it was like these ideas just started to kind of coalesce and merge as I was kind of digging deeper and deeper. And then all of a sudden I had this like epiphany of like, you're seeing the face of Jesus with this. Wow. And I went, oh my God. And I got really tingly and I got very excited and I short of breath. And I just kind of realized, oh my God, when was the last time this actually anybody saw this of Jesus? And it was when he was alive during his ministry or before that. So his family knew who he was, right? Yeah. And here I'm seeing him now for the first time that I've ever seen anybody. Wow. So this is here's a little card I made. I made a little Jesus card of the type of personalities that he had. And Jesus was compassionate. Jesus was a troublemaker. So anybody who flips the proverbial tables is a troublemaker. And I can tell you this, a troublemaker doesn't show up just because he's doing a ministry. A troublemaker is kind of born that way. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Here's a term
I know all about that.
Yeah. So the term that I came up with that was actually quite surprising was Jesus was an entrepreneur. Ah. So he was out selling the Father. So as the merchant, he's out there looking for opportunities to share the idea of the Father with or to. Wow. Jesus was very determined. Once he set his mind and said that this is what I'm going to do with his ministry, and the 40 days in the desert was the final culmination point for him to be able to say, this is what I'm going to do, and I'm going to do it to the very end. Jesus was enigmatic. So people were confused. In fact, you see it in the New Testament Gospels, and you will also see it in the Gospel of Thomas. His disciples would frequently ask him, "What do you mean by what you're saying? We don't have a clue." And there's a very good reason why they would have no clue. If you think about what Judaism is about, you're thinking about Abraham, Isaac, Noah, David and Goliath, you know, King Solomon. You're looking, or the prophets. You're going to be telling stories that are relating to those types of experiences. And Jesus is talking about a mustard seed, a sower. The kingdom of heaven is like these little children. It had nothing to do with the issues that were going on at hand. In fact, what was going on at hand in first century Judea was absolutely horrific for them. And so they were looking for somebody to save them from an occupation. And yet Jesus is not talking about how to overthrow the Roman Empire. He's talking about the mustard seed or a sower or the little children and the pearl. You know, there's all these different stories that he's telling that they just were not understanding. And I understand why. It had nothing to do with his Hebrew heritage. He was coming from a completely different point of view.
What do you think that point of view was?
Well, how are you going to explain Buddhism if you've never been to the Himalayas? How are you going to explain Hinduism? How are you going to explain Taoism? So he does it the best way he can.
Wow.
And kind of in the traditions of the wisdom traditions that would be associated with Judaism. So there's a whole section of the Old Testament that's associated with wisdom traditions. You know, and Solomon was a man of wisdom, and we see him just, you know, with this incredible mind and capacity to make sense of very complicated things, and Jesus is doing the very same thing.
Wow.
So Jesus he was inclusive. So as Aage said at the beginning of the show, he was looking at essentially the downcast, the people who were poor, the people who were kind of thrown out of his society and who were not allowed kind of access to the society. He was coming to them, and he saw that women were part of the problem. So he wanted to include them into his ministry. He included, you know, a lot of the poor people. He included people that you would normally not want to associate with, whether they be harlots or tax collectors or, you know, Judas Iscariot, who probably was possibly a zealot, and people like that, fishermen. So Jesus was a teacher, so he had the teacher mentality. Jesus was a genius. He was able to take all these ideas and put them together in what I refer to as like E equals MC squared. I mean, if you go back and you read what Einstein had to talk about with E equals MC squared, those are only 5 characters, and yet those 5 characters talk about how light works and time and space works, and you know, it's just very complicated stuff. And Jesus is doing the same thing if you really dig down deep into it. Jesus is a mystic. He's having, you know, mystical experiences on a regular basis. Jesus was really, really tough. I mean, he is no flower child. You know, he's not some guy that's just going to easily roll over. He got in people's faces. He made things hard. You know, you want to know something, you're going to have to follow me. And, you know, broad is the road of destruction and narrow is the road to salvation, in a sense. You know, it's difficult for a man to pass through the eye of the needle. I mean, those are not easy ideas.
Right.
You know, turn the other cheek. Stop judging. Stop condemning. I mean, you go back and you look at all the things that Jesus is talking about, and you're just he's confronting one cultural issue after another, just saying these things are keeping you bound. They're not keeping you enlightened. They're not taking you in a new direction. He's, you know, okay. And so the last thing is he's a poet.
Mm-hmm.
So Jesus is, again, he's using words in ways that are very, in a sense, very poetic. So, you know, be gentle as doves and wise as serpents. I find that very poetical.
Yes.
So he's a very complicated man. He's very smart. And yet he has this whole issue about his body of just wanting to make things happen. And that was his faith. His faith was to make things happen. It wasn't like, oh, I have faith in God. No, he had faith in himself that he can actually do the things that he wanted to do and bring a new understanding of the divine to his people. And he was he did the walk and he did the talk.
Exactly.
He did both. In fact, he did it so well that his followers after him personified him as wisdom, Sophia. He walked the walk and he talked the talk. And so he wasn't somebody who says, oh, just do this, and just do as I say, not as I do. He was showing people along the way. And part of his ministry was showing his disciples exactly what to do in all the situations that he was confronted with. He was confronted with people who needed things. He fed them. He was confronted by people who hated him. He was able to redirect that energy really, really quickly. You who are without sin, cast the first stone. I mean, it's just remarkable what he was able to accomplish and what he did.
Yes.
And the more I look at it, the more amazed I am.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And on top of that is when you ask somebody, where is heaven, or where is the kingdom of heaven, or the first thing they're going to do, and they're going to point upstairs. Well, no, that's not what he said. He said the kingdom of heaven is within you.
He says it's within our midst.
You are God's. Both in John and the Psalms, you can see you are God.
When Jesus says the Father and I are one, that's a Hindu concept, and that concept is associated with the Brahman and the Atman. So it's the big spirit and the small spirit. They're both the same substance. The quantities might be different, but the substance is the same. Yeah. So the big idea is reflecting in the small idea, and the smaller idea is also reflecting in the bigger idea. And so, when you get into Buddhism and Hinduism, and you're listening to some of the people today, and you'll say, the wave in the ocean. And so the wave is just an expression of the ocean. And right now we're acting as if we're the wave. So we're moving along the surface of the ocean. But the wave is still part of the ocean. The wave is the ocean. There's no difference. So that's there's a relationship in the Gospel of Thomas that deals with motion and rest. And this is part of the meaning of that.
Wow. This is amazing. I am loving this. It's just...
Yeah, and then again, the Catholic Church, or the church and many other churches too, they took a lot of writings out of the Bible. Why do you think they wanted to cover that up, or what do you think the story is on that?
Well, I think that you got a product to sell, right? And so eventually it was a product to sell. And so at the very beginning, I think Jesus was trying to be as authentic as he could, and there's money involved in that. So I think that some of the disciples realized that there was money involved, and they liked that lifestyle. And Jesus was like I said, he came from wealth. In fact, somebody's asked me, well, how do you know that? Well, I can do it, just through the analysis of his sayings, because I, put them all together. And, we already discussed that. But there's a saying in the Gospel of Luke, and it says, Jesus was followed by women of means. And that was, hold on a second, that was Mary, the mother of Jesus, Mary Magdalene, a woman by the name of Joanna, who was the wife of a man his name is Cusa, and Cusa was the estate manager of the king of Israel.
Wow.
Holy cow.
Wow.
Wow, that's pretty amazing that you have somebody directly in the court, in a sense, of the king of Israel. And there was another lady that followed him by the name of Susanna. There were other women, but these are called the women of means. Well, Mary, Jesus's mother, was in that group. So Jesus came from money.
Wow. So Jesus came from a wealthy family.
And yet he decided that he wanted to put that away. And that, I never really spent too much time really thinking about that. But, it's always been in the back of my mind that what was he after here? Why did he do this? And that also gets down into the nature of his ministry. He chose to do this, and he knew that by doing this, that death would be on the back end of what it is that he was doing. It was just a matter of time. And yet he had several opportunities that he could have fled. Said, enough of this. I don't want to end up like John the Baptist with my head on a plate. No, he decided that he's still going to do it.
Wow.
Now, this is really, really remarkable. So he knew that when he started that this is like a death sentence. And yet he knew who he was. He knew what eternity was. He knew what immortality was. He knew who the Father was. And that it's still okay.
Amazing.
Yeah, he knew. Yeah, go ahead.
No, you go, okay.
He knew that there was no such thing as death.
Right.
Because the reincarnation concept that was killed off in 325 when they made the first draft to the Bible.
Right.
Everybody before then knew that.
Yeah. So in my studies that there is what is referred to as a soul line. So there's kind of the international date line. On the east side of that international date line, in kind of the Asian area, you have karma and you have reincarnation, and on the other side of the line, you have heaven and hell.
Yeah.
So there's two different ideas, and both of these ideas originate roughly at the same time. It's called the axial age.
Interesting.
So your personal experiences and your personal choices have cosmic consequences, and that's a very new idea at that time.
Wow.
So prior to that, there was we were all, you would say, we're all in this boat, and that's the best it gets. But then once the axial age happened, somewhere around the year 500 BC or a little before, depending on where you were, all of a sudden your personal choices had cosmic consequences. So, here we have today, we're still dealing with that. Do you believe in Jesus? Did you accept Jesus as your Lord and Savior? Oh, well, if you did, you're going to heaven. If you haven't, you're going to hell.
Mm-hmm.
And if I go over into the East, then my actions today are going to have repercussions through karma in what happens to me in my reincarnated life.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Wow. I'm trying to wrap my brain around all this. What a great and different perspective this is. I mean, it's
right. Yeah. So when we all talk about Jesus, we're not looking at him the way that I see him. And all of a sudden, like I said, I'm spending more and more time as I look at him, the more I'm fascinated with him, because he is somebody that achieved great things.
Mm-hmm.
And he said that everybody can do this.
Right.
It's not just him.
Right.
So
I got one question that I've been sitting here thinking about, and I just have to ask it. There is actually some records that indicate that Jesus was not just a single guy. He was married, and in fact, he had several children. What have you found anything like that?
It's my belief that Jesus was married to Mary Magdalene.
Yeah.
Again, as I was studying the New Testament, and part of the research that I had to do with all of this, and of course, like I said at the very beginning, I was on a spiritual odyssey. I ended up reading a lot of anthologies. So I read the Nag Hammadi library. I read the Gnostic library. I read the Dead Sea Scrolls. I read the Apocrypha, the lost books of the Bible. It was important for me just to, this is even before I was interested in writing a book. In fact, there was no book. I just was interested and fascinated by the subject. And so I was just reading all these things. And so I started to come across ideas that I found rather curious and rather disturbing when it came to the Essenes and the Jews and Jesus and the and the first Christians. And that is, there was a tendency that if you didn't agree with the group and you were outside of the group, that you were smeared. So if you were in the group and you were an important person in the group, then you were elevated. So in the Essene group, there was the teacher of righteousness, and then there's also the wicked priest. So somewhere along the line, the wicked priest realized something that didn't coincide or didn't fit with the way he felt about how the Essenes should go or act or be or involve themselves in, and he ended up leaving. And so by leaving, he took a lot of people with him, and he was considered the wicked priest. And so when I read the New Testament Gospels, I'm seeing the same trend. How come Thomas is considered a doubter? How come Mary Magdalene is considered a harlot? How come how come his family or his mother is elevated to the mother of God? How come Jesus is elevated to the Son of God? It seemed rather curious to me that there was two things that were going on. Those who might not have agreed with the idea of the proto-Christians, they all got smeared. And the people who now they wanted to promote all got elevated. Jesus and his mother were elevated into this extraordinary status. And I see this same tendency in the Dead Sea Scrolls. We're seeing it today in our society. Hey, you like Donald Trump? Well, you're a fascist and you're a racist.
Right.
You're just seeing the smearing going along, and that was the same thing that was going on back then.
Yeah.
Interesting. So
think about it this way: how come none of his disciples are written? They didn't write anything, or his family. Where are they? They probably had a lot to say. So who do we see? Well, we see Peter. Who's Peter? Well, he was supposed to be one of Jesus's most devoted as disciples. So who is he now? He's considered the father of the church. Funny, Jesus never spoke about a church. Did you notice? Jesus never spoke of the church.
Mm-hmm.
He went from town to town and city to city and village to village. He never said, oh, I'm setting up a church here, and all you guys think this way now. No, he just figured, hey, if you want to know more about who I am, follow me.
Right.
So it wasn't until afterwards, and I would imagine there was a lot of people that were out in Judea and probably up in what present day Lebanon is, or Syria, that went, hey, there's this guy, now that he's dead, what do I do with all this? And so I think the disciples came around and collected them all, in a sense.
Mm-hmm.
And then Paul had to go up into the Greco-Roman world, more in the north, in Turkey and in Greece and in Rome, to collect all of his followers. So I have a saying about Paul and Jesus. So Paul has an axe to grind, and Jesus has a problem to solve.
That's great.
So Paul, Paul's a very interesting character, and I think that he's had a number of experiences in his life that had to kind of transform him. But at the very beginning of his ministry and who he was, because he was persecuting the Christians, this guy was a thug. He was really kind of a mean, nasty guy.
Wow. So just to go back a little bit, so was Jesus the Son of God? And if not, where did that come from? Because I know you were talking about Pythagoras before, but I didn't quite get that.
I am not a believer that Jesus is the Son of God. That term was used to designate anybody who was the son of an emperor.
Ah.
Yeah.
So that brings up a whole new question. Why is Jesus being considered the Son of God when at the time that the Gospels were written, the person who at the time was legally the Son of God was Titus, who was a general who was sacking Jerusalem, and his father was Vespasian, who Flavius Josephus, when he was confronted during the Galilean Wars, that Vespasian was written about in the Old Testament as the prophet of the Jews who's come to save the Jews. Interesting.
Wow.
This is so interesting. And so Vespasian left the siege of Jerusalem and the conduct of the war to his son Titus. He had to go back and he had to dispose Nero.
Wow.
And then he became essentially God. And his son Titus technically was the Son of God. So now what we're going to start seeing is in the Gospels, we're going to start seeing how an alternative kingdom is actually created and how a God is created in this alternative universe. Because the Roman emperors had their own way of how you become God, how you become the emperor. And so now that you have this upstart Christian group, and they're going to follow in the same footsteps, but in a different manner. This is all very fascinating stuff.
It's amazing.
Yeah.
It's all a resistance movement to Rome, because Rome was very cruel. In some regards, it's unbelievable, but at this other time, it was a fairly cruel place. And as they said, you're either for me or against me, and you see that even that idea is put into Jesus's mouth. But I don't think that was necessarily something that Jesus said. But it was an idea at the time. So one of the techniques of Rome is that they always wanted to go conquer new people because they wanted New Texas to keep the thing going. And they ended up in Judea for a variety of reasons. And they were collecting taxes to fund, to fund several families. But that was part of who the Roman Empire was. So what the Roman Empire did is they made certain people part of the group, the in crowd. So they would give them special status. And they had, I think there was like 3 or 4 degrees of citizenship. So at the very bottom, you were a slave. But that's not to say that you could never become, that you wouldn't be able to get out of being a slave. You can be bought, you can be sold, you could serve your sentence, so to speak, and you can become a normal citizen. But in Rome, you had to serve in the army, you had to pay taxes, and so they had different degrees of citizenships on how much you got to participate, whether you could vote or not. And so when they go into these conquered territories, they allowed the elites of those territories to come in and be part of the Roman Senate. Wow. And that way they were able to quell some of the problems that were occurring in those regions that they occupied.
Wow. So did Paul invent his own religion?
That's a very loaded question. There are certain things about Paul that he is borrowing from different traditions to make his own gospel. And he even says in the gospel, in the letters of Rome, he says, "This is my gospel."
Wow.
So he, like I said, Paul's a fairly complicated individual, and there's a lot of his backstory that I kind of understand and I'd like to know more about. But technically, he lived in what is referred to today as the south of Turkey, right there near the border of Syria and Turkey on the Mediterranean. And he ended up in Jerusalem. And when a long time ago, 20 years ago or more, when I was reading the New Testament, I'd read it a lot, I started to realize that Paul had a love affair. He was in love with someone. And I felt that he went to Jerusalem because he wanted her hand in marriage, and he didn't get it. And then, in fact, when I read Eusebius, that's exactly what happened. That's what he says happened. At the same time, Paul ended up becoming somewhat of the strong arm for, the Jewish Cabal. And so he was out doing their dirty work, killing people, beating them up, roughing them up, and whatnot. And so I started to realize that Paul, he was a man who had great ambitions in life, and yet he was thwarted on several occasions. So the highest he was ever going to get was where he was as a thug, and he was never going to be allowed in the inner ring, so to speak. And he's never going to get the hand of the woman that he was in love with. And so he ended up having, I think, a mental break, realizing that there's nowhere for him to go. And yet he had all these desires to do something kind of big. And he ended up picking up Christianity and inventing a great deal of it and moving it down the road of the way that he did. But it's not really, Christianity is his invention. He's like essentially the first Christian. Jesus is not. He just used Jesus as a vehicle.
Interesting.
Yeah.
And so Paul, this is fascinating because when you read the Egyptian Book of the Dead, Paul's quoting directly from it.
Really?
He's
word by
quoting
word.
directly from the Egyptian Book of the Dead. I write about it in one of my chapters in my book. And so the Last Supper has a Egyptian Book of the Dead quality to it. And one of the things that Paul really peddled was immortality and how you get immortality. And once I started to realize that you're looking at immortality as part of the Christian creed and doctrine, I asked myself, well, what were the other ideas of immortality that were circulating not only in the East, but in the Middle East and in the Mediterranean area? And so you have the Egyptian, or you have the Eastern point of view of immortality. So in Buddhism, you have emptiness. In Hinduism, you have nothingness, and you have reincarnation. And in the Greek idea of immortality, you have doing something great in battle so that your name will be remembered. So immortality is being remembered throughout history. So you see somebody like Hercules, and fitting that bill. And then in the Persian area, you have the Epic of Gilgamesh and their idea of immortality. Gilgamesh was a king, and he was born. His father was a god, and his wife or his mother was a human, and so he was 60% god and 40% human. And he felt that because he was part god, that he should have the same access to immortality as the gods. And so he went on a quest to find out if that's really true. And he got to the top of the mountain, and he met a guy whose name I can't pronounce, who is the forerunner of Noah. And Noah says to him, by the way, you'll never get immortality because you're still human. And he said, so the best you can be is you're king. So essentially eat, drink, and be merry because you're going to die. So immortality is not for you. And then when you go down into the Egyptian ideas, immortality occurs after you're dead, and you have to go on a very protracted odyssey to get through the underworld and then finally get judged, and then you can go off. And so off into immortality. But you have to discard your human body to do that. And so they had a whole rite and ritual, and lo and behold, in Paul's writings, you're seeing what that was. He lifted that idea that your body is going to be transformed in an instant into a spiritual body. So immortality was an interesting concept. The Jews didn't believe in immortality, and that came later. So at the time of Jesus, this was a bit of an issue on whether or not that was true or not. So if you read your Old Testament, when there are Israel is defined by when they were nomadic and when they were a tribe, when they were in Egypt, and then when they became a nation state. So that's when Israel came into being, so to speak. Mm-hmm. And then they lost their state with the Assyrians and then the Babylonians. And it wasn't until Cyrus the Great, who was referred to as the King of Kings, and we've heard that Jesus is also the King of Kings, he allowed the exiled Israelites to go back to Israel and rebuild their temple. So that's referred to as the Second Temple period. And during that period, they didn't believe in immortality. And it wasn't until Alexander the Great showed up and, he took over the Western world. And then when he died, his generals took over. And one of them, who ruled the Syrian area, was really, he hated old-time religion, and he hated kind of these old ways of thinking, and he persecuted the Jews. And the Jews understood that when they went into exile in Babylon, that they had offended God by not obeying his commandments and living righteously. But during the time of the Seleucid kings, they were persecuted for the very thing that they were supposed to do, which was be righteous Jews and live righteous lives and follow the dictates of the Torah. And so they were doing that, and yet they were brutally murdered and tortured. And so there was this conflict within the Jewish mind as to how could this be? I mean, if God was punishing us before because we weren't following him, how come we're being totally decimated, and this king is sacrificing a pig in the Holy of Holies? How can that possibly be? So that's when you start seeing the rise of Satan and the ideas of immortality. There must be some type of prize that you achieve by not acquiescing to the temptations of wanting to not be tortured anymore, or not by living your faith. And so then immortality started to enter into the equation.
Wow.
So Jesus comes into that dialogue. This is all very, very complicated. It's all very exciting, a lot of fun.
It is. It's amazing. So I'm just still trying to wrap my brain around how you can even look at the expanse of everything that you have looked at. I mean, in one lifetime, and your lifetime isn't even over. So it has got to be a download or a mystical experience for you to be where you are now. Amazing.
Well, there's a lot of spokes in the wheels, and it finally came together. So in Jungian therapy, it's called conjunction. When you have all these ideas and they finally come together and they coalesce into something, and that happened to me.
Wow.
So this is a form of conjunction.
Amazing. So just because you teased us with it before, What are the 7 things that, what is it that the church never told you, or that, what was it?
The
Okay.
church will not talk about?
Yeah.
So here's some of the things. So I have some notes here, so I'll just read some of the notes and some of the quotes, if that's all right.
Please.
Yeah.
So the Father is not born of woman. So Jesus says in the Gospel of Thomas, and it's saying number 15, he says, when you see one who is not born of a woman, bow down and worship. That is your Father. Wow.
Wow.
No kidding.
Wow.
So when Jesus speaks of the pearl, he's speaking of the self. So the pearl, when you go out and you dig the field and you find the pearl's you. You're it.
Wow.
So you have to sell everything to make sure that that pearl is not only is it precious, but you're cultivating it. So Jesus says in the Gospel of Matthew, Matthew 13:45, he says, again, the kingdom of heaven is like some trader looking for beautiful pearls. When that merchant finds one priceless pearl, he sells everything he owns and buys it. You're it.
Wow.
So that also coincides with Thomas saying number 3, in which Jesus says, and number 110, he says, the kingdom is inside of you and outside you. When you know yourselves, then you will be known, and you will understand that you are the children of the living God. And in saying 110, Jesus says, whoever finds self is worth more than the world.
Yeah.
So you're not here to be saved, through salvation. You're to be awoken. So the virgin birth is that divine aspect inside of yourself that's awakening. And as it awakens, the old self has to die. That's the death. And the resurrection is when that fully becomes awake and alive in your life, and you're now living in accordance with Jesus. And as you're doing it, you're doing what he did, which is you're emptying yourself and you're ascending. You're becoming more and more like the Father.
Wow.
Okay, so you've heard of the sacred marriage, and the sacred marriage is when the church is married to Jesus. Well, the early version of that is that there is a lower aspect of yourself. One, it's very instinctual. It's all very lustful. It's all, what I need to do with the here and now and how I'm motivated. And you have an ego. Well, when your higher self, that divine spark awakens, you realize that you're in this body, and now you're married to this body, and you have to live with it. It has to be both male and female. So that is different than the way the church relates to it. Jesus spoke about immortality in time by saying that the kingdom of heaven, which is a form of eternity, is already here. So you don't have to go over to the temple down in Jerusalem to figure this out. There's nobody in that room. It's already here. It's in you. You're it.
Yeah.
The kingdom of heaven is inside you. So that's number 5. Number 6, the parable of the mustard seed. It says in Mark 4:30, the kingdom of heaven is like a mustard seed, which is the smallest seed you plant in the ground. Yet when it is planted, it grows and becomes the largest of all the garden plants, with such big branches that the birds of the air can perch in its shade. And so what are we asked to do? We're asked to become more and more of our divine selves.
Yes.
And when we do that, look what happens. And then we have the idea that the end times, God's coming back, and he's, his wrath is going to just destroy everybody. On one hand, what was Jesus's life all about in his ministry and the sacrifice on the cross, other than the wrath of God being poured out onto him, and he's now the sacrificial lamb? So is that act not done, or does God have to come back after some period of time to finish it off? I don't get it. That makes no sense to me. But Jesus says in the Gospel of Thomas, saying number 18, his disciples were asking him, like, when is the end going to come? And Jesus said, for where the beginning is, the end will be. So that's, again, the Alpha and the Omega. So the end is the beginning, and the beginning is the end. So these are the types of ideas that are not necessarily presented by the church, and they don't want you to know this information.
Wow. Wow. So
if you can go on, there's so many more things.
Yeah.
So, but you have to kind of go back. What did Jesus mean by the Father and I are one?
Right.
Why does it just apply to him? No, it applies to everybody.
Wow.
It's just that we're not awake to it. He was. So he recognized it. And then there's another kind of idea of like, well, Jesus says follow him because then, you know, he's going to show you not only compassion, how to manage the body, how to deal with an open heart. The only way you're going to know that is by following him. And the way that I understand that would be like, imagine when the car first arrived, right? It's a horseless carriage. The only way, and if there's only one person, let's just say that was Henry Ford. The only way to experience the car was to go over to Henry Ford and jump on the car and have a car ride. Well, Jesus was presenting something so new and radical. Of course, in the East, it's like normal.
Right.
But for them, it's very different. It's very new. And he's presenting something very different than what anybody knows. And so the only way to get that information is through him. So that's what that really means.
Wow. Wow. So there's a couple of questions. You feel like doing a couple quick questions?
Yeah. Hold on a second. Let me take a sip of water.
Absolutely.
I'm a little on the parched side.
Absolutely. This is amazing. Thank you so much.
Okay.
All right. So Tiffany asks, what would you say about the second coming? I think you just talked a little bit about that.
This is Annette, a very, very fascinating subject. I have to keep asking myself, where do these ideas come from? And I've had a number of mystical experiences, and so now I have to ask myself, can any of these mystical experiences inform me about these ideas? So is there such thing as a second coming? Well, apparently, you know, there must be some second coming, but what is this second coming? Is this the second coming of what Aage would refer to as aliens? Is it Jesus? I would imagine Jesus has been reincarnated back here on Earth several times. I don't think it's just once. So I don't know what this, you know, the man on the white horse is going to do. But does that mean that something might not happen like that? And so maybe within the very deep collective unconscious and kind of the destiny of our world, that there is something that is about to happen in which there is going to be a return of some deity come back to this earth. It's prevalent in a lot of the kind of in other societies, and not just agricultural societies. You see it in the hunting and gathering, and you see it in the kind of early traditions of man. There's something that's going to happen. And we might be right there on the 50-yard line watching this event happen.
Sherry said,
but I'm not completely convinced that Jesus is the one coming back. I think that there's a truth out there of a second coming. The question is what is it? I think that the Christians as they did so many things at this particular time. Part of the Greco-Roman era at that time was called syncretism, in which you take ideas and you put them together that normally they shouldn't have been together, but now they are because they did it. And that's one of the ideas that the Christians took, and they kind of embedded into their philosophy and their ideas.
Wow, amazing. So Sherry, just to address your question, you said, why speak in code? You hate the parable. So I don't know if you were here earlier, but we were kind of unpacking the Jesus and his personality traits, and that he was a genius, and we kind of touched upon that and the way that he expressed himself. So you might want to go back and listen to that. But thank you for your question.
No, I totally believe. Listen to what Jesus is saying. There's a lot of truth to those sayings. And what I found is that there's a lot of autobiographical content in Jesus' sayings. So kind of look at that from the point of view that Jesus is telling me something about his own personality and his own experiences in his life. Yeah. So when he says, a house divided cannot stand, I had to ask myself, okay, I bet you there's several different layers to this. There's probably the Judean layer, like his whole community. But what if it's also about his family? And I went even deeper. I said, what would happen if there was maybe a conflict within Jesus?
Right.
Maybe we have our own houses that, there's a conflict within ourselves. So maybe he was struggling with his own humanity, his own desires, his own issues, and well, man, maybe I don't want to do this anymore. You know, I don't know. I'm just throwing that out there. But there seems to be conflict when you say something like that, and it's not just exterior. I know enough of, you know, with my dream analysis with a Jungian analyst that, you know, when you say stuff like that, it's also referencing something that's also going inside of you, because you're recognizing something outside that is also inside.
Right.
So that's where I go with that. So you know, I'm not speaking in code. Jesus did kind of, I don't think that he spoke in code. I think he tried to make things as simple as he could, but they just weren't there to understand it.
Yeah, that's amazing. So
just think of it this way. Imagine if Albert Einstein went back to the year 1000 and he's living in France when they're trying to build a cathedral. I mean, do you think that this guy would even be completely understood? No. And it's a little bit, I kind of see that a little bit like Jesus, that, you know, he was kind of so head and shoulders above everybody else that it was hard for people to recognize who he was and what he was. And so the best that they can do is just throw some kind of idea that he was the Son of God. You know, he was the Messiah. And of course, the Messiah was completely bastardized. It doesn't mean what the Christians mean it to be. It just means somebody who was anointed by God. That could be anybody. It doesn't mean that Messiah equals Son of God. That's what they made the equation out to be. It's not.
Wow. A lot of times, too, is that when you have really complicated things, if you make it into a simple parable, it can be understood.
Yeah, and Jesus was trying as much as he could, trying to make things as easy as possible. But then there was another side to him that is contained in the Gospel of Thomas that was much more complicated and much more deep. And you had to spend time pondering the meanings of those ideas.
Well, I have a feeling
it's the open heart. You know, how do you love your neighbor as yourself? I mean, just try it. It's really hard. Try not judging people. Try not condemning people, which is, you know, what we all want to do. Try it. I mean,
it's so hard.
It's a very difficult practice.
It's so hard.
And we're running over a little bit here, so I was thinking, go ahead, Nori.
I was just going to say, I think I'm going to binge read your book tonight, because it's just amazing. I just wanted to ask, how can people find you? How can people find your book?
My book is on Amazon. It's under David Collis, Interviewing Jesus the Man. There's 3 versions of it. There's a print version, there's an ebook version, and there's an audio version. I got to spend three weeks doing the audio version of that. I'm also, my website is www.davidcollis.com, and you can look at my website. Awesome. And I'm also on Facebook. I use David Collis Author.
Wow, awesome. Aage, you want to take us out? Thank you so much.
Oh, then my last question is, if you could talk to the whole world and tell them something of a spiritual nature, what would you tell them?
I'm going to go back and use kind of what the Eastern mystics would say, is that whatever you want to know, it's inside of you.
Yeah.
So allow yourself the opportunity to start listening to yourself, to follow your heart, and to listen to your intuitions, and know that there's the journey of self-discovery is endless. And don't be afraid to go down there, because it's an amazing journey, and I recommend it for anybody and everybody. Don't be afraid, and don't be afraid to be open-minded and have an open heart, and to look to see what all of our ancestors have been writing about. It's all there, and it's all inside of you as well.
So good.
So,
yay, thank you.
Hey, thank you so much for letting me be on your show, and hopefully we can do this again.
Thank you. Thank you, Aage.
Yeah, thank you very much. And
really great. We need a part 2 for sure.
Just let me know.
All right.
All right.
Chat room, thank you. Margaret, thank you for being here, our moderator. Thank you, everybody, for listening and clicking the thumbs up button. And we'll see you next week. Same time, same bat station. Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Shalom.
Shalom.
Are we off the air?